Can I just get an idea of how many people are planning to irrigate in autumn or in spring? So we've got a few, so that at least makes this session relevant. How many people are planning to carry over water this season? Yep, a few people are planning to carry over. Yep. How many people are likely to buy water at between $400 and $500 a meg? Yep, okay. Yep, got a few there. Yep. And in the past, how many people have sold water and used it to buy in feed for livestock? No one in this session. In the previous sessions, we did have a few that had done that. Yep. So this session is about what water is worth compared to bought-in feed. So the assumed situation is that you've got animals, livestock. You want to feed them. You want to feed them well. So is it cheaper to use irrigation water at a given price to feed them, or to use bought-in feeds like hay or grain? The process was developed about 10 years ago by Ian Gibb at Farm Anco and Kevin Kelly. Kev has since passed away, and yeah, bless his soul. So this sort of process is, or this work is a bit of Kev's legacy. Al Lawson, an agronomist researcher at CAI, and myself recently had a look at this process and the figures and tweaked it a bit just to make it a bit more suitable for this presentation and a bit more up to date. So what we're looking at this session is what water is worth for use in spring, in autumn, and also for use in spring. And as the bottom diagram suggests, is that nowadays most people see water as a substitute for bought-in feeds. And many farmers are very good at costing out water compared to bought-in feeds, and there's probably a lot of people in this room that could deliver this session as well. So just before we talk about costing out water, probably worth discussing some of the risks. So some of the risks of purchasing water, or I suppose irrigating, is that it comes in wet. So you end up, with waterlogged paddocks and losing some of that growth response. When it's wet, water price is also likely to drop. So you've probably done some dough there. If it's autumn, you can carry the water over. But a bit of a risk of losing some of that water due to spill. And Andrew probably discussed this morning that there's likely to be a low risk of spill this coming season, particularly on the Goulburn, but even on the Murray, I think it was calculated to be about 30%. So at this stage, spill looking pretty unlikely. And in comparison, like in a dry year with irrigation, likely to get a much better response and good pasture growth over autumn, winter and spring. So the process used in this session is like a marginal response type of approach, looking at what extra feed you'll grow with the extra water that you put on. So how many tonnes of extra feed per megalitre, and what's the cost of that feed at a given price of water, so then you can compare it to your bought-in feeds. So it assumes in this situation that the costs of fertiliser and sowing cultivation are already sunk. What we're interested in is the extra water and the growth response. So to work out like the water cost, first of all we need to know how much water we're likely to use. So I've assumed 1.5 megs for the first irrigation in autumn, and then half a meg for the irrigations after that. and similarly in spring, 0.7 megs for the first irrigation and half a meg for the second irrigation after that. In terms of the total yield, you can see we've got 3 irrigation scenarios there. The first one there with no irrigation or dry land, 1 irrigation, 15th of April start on 1.5 meg per hectare, and then 2 irrigations, 2 megs per hectare, 3 irrigations, 2.5. You see a range in dry matter production there from 1 tonne per hectare to 5 tonnes per hectare. So it is quite a high yielding annual pasture that we're talking about here, and that's to the end of July. And just make note that it is total yield rather than down their throats. So in terms of the extra yield with irrigation water over and above our dry land, you can see like in the wet winter, I'll just mention too the difference between the dry average and wet winter. We've assumed to be about one irrigation between each of those. But the dry matter response in the wet winter there, basically no dry matter response. We're saying there's adequate moisture there already. In the average winter, in the average winter, we're picking up response to each of those irrigations, but not as big as the dry matter response in the dry winter autumn. So we've got our water usage and we've got our dry matter response for this case study. Next is working out how many tonnes per meg we're producing with that irrigation. So basically no response in the wet winter. In the average winter scenario, picking up a response, but not as big with not improving with the second and third irrigation compared to just one. But in the dry winter, that response is improving in terms of the tonnes per meg, mainly because we're diluting that higher water use with the first irrigation, because we're only using half a meg per hectare for each irrigation after that. So once we've got our tonnes per meg, we can then compare it to bought-in feeds at a given water cost. And we've got the different scenarios here with 1, 2 and 3 irrigations. And you can see at $500 a meg, like roughly the current price, the feed's still reasonably expensive based on that tonne per meg ratio. And down here I've put in like the fodder costs, so lucerne roughly at $500 a tonne, and canola hay at 330 odd bucks a tonne. Pasture probably been a better quality feed than hay, and also setting up for autumn is I suppose the first, establishing in autumn as the first step for setting up for spring, where you're getting more bang for your buck. And I'll just mention, with the pasture growth, we're talking about total yield. With the hay, so that's fresh weight, and you can probably assume some wastage there too. So not apples with apples, but still still at least a comparison. And we mentioned, like in the average autumn, the response generally not quite as high with the second and third, so a little bit more expensive. In the wet situation, no response, so obviously very high cost for that extra dry matter you're growing with the irrigation. Moving into spring, where we are getting more bang for our buck, you can see, and this is just to the end of September, so it's August and September, and the assumption is low or no initial allocation, given that if it's a higher allocation, then water price is likely to come down, and if you carry it over water, you know, you've probably done a bit of dough there if you bought it at 500 bucks a meg. So yeah, in the yields there in spring from about one tonne per hectare to 5 tonnes per hectare. So, you know, again, reasonably high yields that we've put in here for growing in those 2 months there. In terms of the extra dry matter, so same as autumn, we're not growing anything extra if it comes in wet, and really picking up a response in an average spring with that first irrigation, but not so much with the second one. We're only growing an extra couple of tonnes in both. So in terms of carryover water, you might question whether you'd carry over enough for 2 irrigations, given you're really only getting that response to one. You know, a growth response in a dry spring to 1 irrigation and 2 irrigations. And in terms of tonnes of meg, so extra feed grown for the extra water you put on, pretty close to 3 tonne of meg. So, you know, pretty good bang for your buck, as you might expect in spring, given the higher growth rates and lower water usage compared to summer. So in terms of comparing it to bought-in feeds for spring, you see there at 500 bucks a meg, we've added a bit extra there for the 5% loss of your carryover water, but pretty cheap feed in this situation, given the higher conversion rate. I've bumped up those prices a bit, given the drier winter spring conditions. If you come into the spot market and don't carry over, you know, you're likely to be purchasing water in spring at that higher price, given the drier conditions. Even then, you know, if you've got a good pasture base to irrigate, you can get a good response and relatively cheap feed compared to bought-in feed. But the response, again, not quite as high in an average winter-spring. And as Dave mentioned, you know, like carryover is one way to take water, to get water in the spring. But, you know, Dave put up a lot of other options that, you know, you'd be aware of, like forward contracts and potentially even parking water on someone else's entitlement if you don't have entitlement yourself. But obviously there's fees and charges involved in that too. And as we mentioned, you know, pretty much no response in that wet scenario, so expensive feed. Sorry. I've put together like both the winter and spring responses, but just keeping in mind, this is really only until the end of September, and I've costed out water there at 500 bucks. So we've just added up the water use and the extra growth from autumn and in spring, and then worked out our tonnes per meg and sort of what that means in terms of the cost of the feed in a dry scenario overall. So looking at sort of 250 to 320 bucks a tonne, and as I mentioned, that's without that autumn growth. So if you without the October growth, if you included the October growth, those prices would come down. But, and again, overall, not as, or a bit more expensive with the average autumn, winter, spring, given the lower response, about 320 to 420 bucks a tonne. So just to finish up, at current water prices, watering for use in autumn and in spring can provide relatively cheap feed compared to bought-in feed with good management. Obviously, there's risks involved in that, you know, coming in wet or potentially getting lower than expected yields or higher than expected water use, but also risks not irrigating, which, you know, explains why most guys are putting out their water and it coming in dry and then being on the market.